and ready than myself to guide this conversation. So I'm going to quickly, introduce our moderator and our amazing panelists who I'm really excited to hear from. It's been like awesome, even just getting to learn from them in the conversations in planning this talk. But I'm going to introduce first Dr. Analucía Lopezrevoredo. She's a Peruvian Chilean American Jutina, born in Peru and raised in Spain and the United States. An anti-oppression educator and researcher, Analucía's research interests include Latino/X migration studies, asset-based and culturally relevant education models for immigrant integration, documenting and strengthening resiliency amongst Latino/Latinx migrants, Jewish migrating to Latin America, ethics and social work, anti-oppressive practice, and how to teach effectively on these issues. Her passion for elevating Latino/Latinx culture and narratives within the Jewish community led her to found Jutina Eco, which is also a JLF grantee. So shout out for that. We absolutely love her. An organization dedicated to nurturing Latin Jewish community identity, leadership, and resiliency that also invites community members to engage in critical dialogue about Jewish and Latin multiculturalism. Analucía, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Jordan. Thank you for that intro. My voice is on the mend, but I'm super happy to be here. I've been saving it for this panel. So if you're wondering if I'm okay, I am okay, and I'm super happy to be here. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here. Our next panelist who we'll introduce is Ari Y. Kelman, who holds the Jim Joseph Chair in Education and Jewish Studies at Stanford University and is a member of the Department of Religion by courtesy, an affiliate of the Taview Center for Jewish Studies and a member of the American Studies Committee in charge. He's the author of Station Identification, A Cultural History of Yiddish Radio in the United States, the editor of Is This a System? A Milt Gross comic reader, and the co-author of Sacred Strategies, Transforming Synagogues from Functional to Visionary, which won a 2010 National Jewish Book Award. He has written widely about the production of religious knowledge in evangelical worship music and in Jewish education. Ari, how are we?
All right, we're doing okay. Long day, but all right. Good to see you.
I definitely feel that. And our final panelist, Professor Samira Mehta, is an assistant professor of women and gender studies and of Jewish at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research and teaching focus on the intersections of religion, culture, and gender, including the politics of family life and reproduction in the United States. Her first book, Beyond Chrismaka, The Christian Jewish Interfaith Family in America, which, sidebar, I just think is an amazing name, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Her current academic project, God Bless the Pill, Sexuality and Contraception in Tri-Faith America, examines the roles of Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant voices in competing moral logics of contraception, population control, and eugenics from the mid-20th century to the present, and is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press. She has a book of personal essays entitled The Racism of People Who Love You, Essays on Mixed Race Belonging, forthcoming from Beacon Press in 2023. She's the primary investigator of a Henry Luce Foundation-funded project entitled Jews of Color, Histories and Futures, and holds degrees from Swarthmore College, Harvard, Emory, and is an absolute delight to talk with. So please, Samira, let us know how you're doing. How are things?
I am great, and I just want to let everyone know that I may be joined by my co-presenters, Quincy the cat, who will likely appear visually if he appears, and Daisy the dog, who will likely appear vocally if she appears.
I would certainly love to see all of them. So before I back off and hand it to Analucía, we're going to have by the end of the panel, there will be a Q&A. If you have questions that you actually want to get answered by our panelists and not just sit in the chat for everyone to look and respond to, please send the Q&A to me. My name in the chat even says Jordan Mann Q&A, send to me. We'll be filtering some of those to send to our panelists at the end. And until then, thanks so much to IfNotNow. Thanks so much, JLF. Thanks so much, all of our panelists. We're really excited to hear from you all today. So I'll be off, send me your chats, and I'm here to learn with the rest of you.
All right, I'm just going to jump in. So buenas tardes, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is that people are. I'm feeling really lucky to be able to moderate this particular session because Ari and Samira are just not just wonderful people, but really true visionaries and true thinkers around what is research and what is the role that it has in telling the story of the Jewish people and the responsibility. So they're badasses. So excuse my language, but I have to put that out there just to kind of preface the excitement I have for this particular session. Now we've met at different points in time, and last week we were kind of coming together to kind of finalize like what was the story we really wanted to share in this hour that we have with all of you. And before we get started, or as we're getting started, I'm going to imagine that not everyone here is a social scientist, someone who even likes research. So I want to take a couple of steps back and give both Ari and Samira the opportunity to share with us, in their opinions, what is data and what it can do, and specifically what is the role that data has had up until this point in understanding the Jewish community. And I'll have them jump in whenever they're ready. Samira, go for it.
Okay, so my work sort of structurally pulls from two different fields, maybe three. My primary mode of investigating is historical. I work with archives. I go to libraries. I once thought about studying 17th century, and it turns out that I'm allergic to decaying leather. So that was a bad plan. Couldn't do that. And so I study post-World War II American religion. And again, lots of stuff from archives, lots of cultural sources. So a lot of plays and magazines and movies and TV shows. And then the third thing that I do is more along the lines of what you might think of as coming from anthropology. I do a lot of ethnographic work. I do some oral history work, which means asking people to tell me their stories. And I do participant observation, which means I go and hang out. I spend a lot of time watching people very carefully while I hang out with them. But really, a lot of participant observation is hanging out and then writing it down, taking notes, basically keeping a journal of what you saw while you were there. And then I do something called semi-structured interviews, which is mostly, to me, what makes a semi-structured interview different from an oral history of the kinds of questions you ask. When I ask someone a set of oral history questions, I really sort of start out and ask them to tell the story of their life. When I refer to something as a semi-structured interview, it often means that I've done participant observation and I want to ask people about the things that I've seen. But that's sort of how I make the distinction, and it matters sometimes on the back end. Matters for the kinds of conversations you have with the university as you're setting up permission to do work. But in a lot of ways, it doesn't necessarily matter for the kinds of data that I'm generating. So that's what I do. And I think that the thing that we really get, and from this data, are ways of shaping the stories that we tell, right? We all have stories that we learn about the world that we live in. And sometimes those stories are really well grounded in our experiences, but maybe not well grounded in the experiences of other people, right? Like, I don't have a lot of insight into what it means to not grow up in New England. I have a lot of thoughts about growing up in New England and no thoughts about growing up in California, right? Like, so you've got that kind of thing. But sometimes we have cultural stories that we all tell ourselves, and those stories have a lot of power. You know, a really classic example of this would maybe be Thanksgiving, right? We have this story of Thanksgiving that you learn. If you watch, when I was a kid, I watched this cartoon about mice on the Mayflower, and it was a lovely, lovely story of religious freedom that doesn't take into account, for instance, the people who were already here, or even whether or not those people who were coming here for religious freedom wanted religious freedom for everyone or just for themselves, right? And so to me, unpacking all of those stories and collecting all of the stories helps you figure out what the best narrative to tell would be, right? The story that I want my nephew to know about Thanksgiving is not the story that I learned, in lots of ways, not just the genocide piece of the story, but lots of other things about what was going on. And so to me, that's what research gives us. It gives us ways of figuring out whether we're telling stories that kind of map on to a broad range of experiences in the world. And I will pass it off to Ari.
Thanks, Samira. Thanks, Jordan, for organizing, and Analucía for facilitating all of you all to spend your afternoons and evenings with us talking about this stuff that I spend all day thinking about. So it's nice to get a chance to talk to people who may or may not want to hear what I have to say. So I do a lot of the same methods as Samira when it comes to gathering data. Data is just another word for information. Historians tend not to use the word data. They tend to use the word evidence or documentation. Social scientists tend to use the word data, tends to be associated with numbers. But data is inert. 32%, right? 4 out of 5 dentists who recommend that their patients chew gum recommend sugarless gum. Data doesn't really tell us much. I'm a professor of education. Turns out that the thing I've been studying all along my whole career is how people package up information to transmit to somebody else, and then how those other people unpack it and make meaning from it. That's what education is about, I think. And whether I write about Christian worship music or Yiddish radio or Jewish social science, that's the question that I'm interested in. How do people package up information and try to tell it to somebody else? And then how do those other people unpack it to try to make meaning from it? Data is part of that packaging. I spend a lot of time with social scientific studies of American Jewry, both doing them myself. Some of the ways that Samira does, I do a little more of the quantitative stuff, but not entirely. Surveys and so on. I should say off the bat that I'm not a demographer. I was not trained as a demographer, and I don't do demography. I critique demographers, which is a different thing. But I'm interested in the way that certain stories get told, and how it is that people produce the data that then becomes the heart of certain ways the stories are packaged and the ways those stories get unpackaged. So data on its own doesn't do anything. One of my favorite numbers to come out of the recent Pew study is that 43% of American Jews report that they get great personal and spiritual satisfaction out of spending time with their pets. Now, one can look at that data point and say, that's fantastic. We should give pets to all American Jews and they would be spiritually and personally much more happy. That would probably be a bad conclusion. The other way to look at it is to say, we should put Samira in charge. Another way to look at it is to say that people are getting a lot more personal and spiritual satisfaction out of their pets than they are out of their religious practices, because only 20% of American Jews said that they get that kind of satisfaction from their religious practice. Some people see that as bad news, some people see that as good news, but that's part of the unpackaging that I was talking about. When we construct surveys, when we write interview scripts, formal or informal, when we pick a research site to observe as an ethnographer, all of those are part of how those data are produced. And the processes by which the data are produced, I think, from my perspective, tell us a great deal about the variety of stories or the range of stories that we're able to interpret out on the other end. And so I don't just see data as the number in the middle. I think those numbers or those narratives or whatever they are, whatever you think the data is, are sort of inert, but it's where they fall in that long process of sort of producing, packaging, and then unpackaging, and then making meaning from, that I think is where stuff gets really interesting.
Thanks, Ari. And thank you, Samira. And I agree. I think pets would make us all a little bit more happy. No, dogs. What are you talking about, Jordan? Gosh. Anywho, a couple of terms that came up, and I want to make sure that we understand them because they are going to be part of our continued conversation, and that's ethnography and being an ethnographer. An ethnographer is someone who studies and describes the culture of a particular society or group. And a demographer, on the other hand, is an expert in the study of statistics relating to the changing structure of human populations. So both a demographer and an ethnographer are central to how we are thinking about Jewish studies and how we are expanding the field and thinking about the questions that we're asking and why certain things are important than others. And that leads to so many other things around storytelling and interpretation, which we'll get to in a little bit. But this particular session is really about asking that question as to who speaks for the Jews. And this is a series about addressing the question of who holds the power for Jewish communal narratives. And so I think it's important to note that it's not just researchers who hold the power, but oftentimes it's the funders who are funding that research. Most of the time it is that marriage and that power dynamic. And so I'm curious in both your opinions, and Ari, we're going to start with you. If you could share with us some of your thoughts and on how previous studies that have particularly been exclusively around the Jewish community or have looked at the Jewish community as part of larger studies, how have they failed to count or capture the stories and opinions of Jews of color, queer Jews, Jewish women, Jews from interfaith families, secular Jews? I know you just mentioned some specifically. So I'm curious if you could just kind of draw out a little bit more based on your experience.
Sure. So let me also take a step back and say there's a huge array of research in Jewish studies, a small minority of which has to do with the contemporary moment and Jews who are living, most of which is historical, going way back. So in terms of the field of Jewish studies, of which both Samira and I are a part, most of it, the vast majority, focuses on things that went down, I would say, before the 19th century. Samira, does that sound about right to you?
It's really important to remember that Jewish studies includes all of the people, or anyone who does this and wants to be included, who study the Hebrew Bible, who study rabbinics, all of the Talmud scholars, but also historians of sort of long ago. And Ari and I are pretty close colleagues. As you'll see, we don't agree on everything, but we work in a very small corner. And we are people who not only work in a pretty small corner together, but are generally speaking in the same sort of, in pretty much agreement about a lot of what happens in that corner. So I think it is useful to know that you're hearing from a really thin slice of the field right now.
Yeah, we think there's something valuable from our thin slice of the field to say, but the field is really big and we're just a small part of it. The kinds of research that gets the most attention in the American Jewish world is demographic research, the study of Jewish populations. There are national Jewish studies, so studies of the United States population nationally. There were a few national Jewish population studies in 1970, 1990, and 2000. And then the Pew Research Center, which is a nonpartisan research center in Washington, D.C., did a study in 2013 and another one that came out last year. And then since 1970, there's over 100 local population studies that have been done of communities big and small. New York has done 5 or 6, Los Angeles has done 1, Florida does a ton. And I can tell you, because I've looked at this stuff pretty extensively, I probably should have looked at the numbers before we got back on the call. But for all those studies done between 1970 and 2020, which is when my analysis stopped, there were, I think, 132, but I don't quote me on that. I think that number could be wrong. A minority of which, so the majority of those studies, local population studies of American Jewry, did not ask a question about race or ethnicity. So it's not that that means that all Jews identified as white. It means that we literally do not know how those Jews identified racially. Most of those studies include, well, most of those studies, well, I didn't look at gender and sexuality, so I can't say. But I can tell you that specifically with respect to the racialized identity of American Jews, the majority of the studies did not look. Those that did it in often did it in these sort of strange idiosyncratic ways. They would only there were a series of studies that only asked if the respondent was Hispanic, but didn't ask if they were African American or didn't ask if they were white. There were a number of, the most popular approach, some of the studies didn't ask at all, but then sort of used census data to impute percentages of Jews, African American Jews, Latinx Jews, and so on from the population, but didn't bother asking the respondents themselves. The most popular approach was a sort of bundled up single question that said something along the lines of, like, what race do you identify as? And it offered a bunch of different options, including mixed race. So you could click mixed race, but you couldn't identify whether you were, say, Chinese and African American and Jewish. You couldn't identify whether you were white and Latinx and Jewish. You could only identify that you were mixed race. So while we know that there were some mixed race Jews, we don't actually know the dimensions of that that raciality. And if you compare that, from my perspective, one of the striking things about that is, well, there's a number of striking things, but the most striking thing is that if you compare that to the sort of the fairly high level of specificity that people ask about religious identity in American Jewish life. What denomination do you identify with? Do you light Shabbat candles? Do you keep kosher? The sort of prevalence of those kinds of questions, which are considered kind of normative and typical, even for the federations, which generally sponsor these studies or co-sponsor them. Federations which are not known for being particularly gung-ho on religion, those religious questions were present in all of the studies. And so for me, again, thinking about the way that data is produced, not just that the data means something unto itself, that the Federation said, we have 20 minutes worth of questions that we're going to ask. We're going to ask 7 questions about religion. We're not going to ask a single question about race. Suggests a kind of a peculiar alignment of values, in particular around evaluation of what kinds of information they thought was important, i.e. religious practice, and what kinds of information they thought was not important, race and ethnicity.
I'm actually going to respond in part by asking Ari to say something that he said in our conversations prepping that was one that I find really interesting and that I care a lot about, but I think because Ari, you were in the room with the Pew study, you might be better able to represent this. But one of the things that we see in questions about Jewish identity, and I think that this again demonstrates sort of, when I say preoccupations of funders, I don't want to imply sort of like nefariousness or anything like that, but just that we all ask questions that are based in our own worldviews, right? So you want to avoid the idea that there's some sort of pure data that is completely and totally objective. The questions we ask, it's maybe impossible for me to do research that doesn't have a feminist bias to it, because feminism structures how I see and understand the world, right? And so one of the things that you see when you try to track things like Jewish identity are ways in which people understand what it means to be Jewish. And so the reason I'm asking Ari to speak about this a little bit is because in the Pew study that came out in 2020, there are a couple of categories that are interesting. You can be a Jew by religion and you can be a Jew by no religion. And I would love to hear a little bit about sort of how that, or have some explanation for folks about where that line was drawn and what that line then means for how we understand the data. But the other thing that Ari, you said when we were talking that I remember from the study, but that I find really striking, and I know that there was some debate about, and I apologize for the barking. It would be an argument for Jordan's maybe just cat's comment. Is this question of whether or not you could count more than one religion. And so what Ari was saying is that if you said you were something other than just Jewish, Daisy, sit. Sorry. If you said you were something other than just Jewish, you got put into another bucket. So for instance, I'm somebody who has studied interfaith families. If you're somebody who does both, you end up in a different category. And that remains true regardless of like whether you're halakhically Jewish, but that also is potentially true if you identify as Jewish and Buddhist, right? That's also true depending potentially on how you frame your yoga practice. And I'm curious, I think that shows sort of concerns and implicit understandings of category coming from funders and coming from researchers. And Ari, how does that shape the way that we understand the data that comes out of that? What's important about how those distinctions fell out?
Sure. So Samira's asking about the Pew study from 2021, which I can talk about because I was on the advisory committee. So I was part of a lot of meetings that led to the production of the study. I think I want to caution us against one thing before we get going, and that is I don't want to impute intention to say funders. I worked on the Pew study. I worked on a number of these studies. I, by and large, have a fairly good working relationship with some of the, I don't even know who funded the Pew study, to be perfectly honest. I never met them. They never talked to me. As far as I could tell, they never had a hand in our discussions or our deliberations. Certainly didn't have a hand in the analysis. I'm not even entirely sure if they would understand the processes that went into the analysis of the data, because I didn't understand them, and I'm pretty close to it. So Samir asked a couple of questions, one of which is the categorization of Jews into these two buckets. Those two buckets, Jews by religion, Jews by no religion, are big for Pew. If you read Pew's research about religion in America, those are incredibly salient categories. For Jews, it's a little bit trickier, because for Pew, you can say, like, there are people who have religion, and then there are people who don't, and those people who don't have religion are called nuns, spelled N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, just to be clear. They are nuns because when you ask them if they have a religion, they say, I have none, on a survey. So that category is a product of a survey writer's need to categorize people who don't have religion. These are not people who walk around saying, I'm a nun. It's not a category that's meaningful to them. And they may, in fact, do things that might be observed from the outside as religious. Turns out, actually, that a significant but small number of evangelical Christians say they have no religion, but they pray regularly, they read the Bible regularly, and they do other things that those on the outside may identify as religious. The reasons they say they have no religion have to do with institutional religion and Protestant Christianity and so on. But they can legitimately say, I have no religion. Jews, for a variety of other reasons, can do the same. In the Pew study, one of the really hard things about surveying Jews is actually getting them to respond, because you can ask a variety of different, getting them to respond affirmatively as Jews, turns out is quite complicated. So you can ask people if their religion is Judaism, which is what Pew did. And if you say my religion is Judaism, you get tracked into the Jews by religion sort of bucket. All of this is available here. I can put the link in the chat. This is the study, and all I'm going to do is narrate page 18 of the study, because this is where it goes down. So you can say, are you Jewish by religion? Yes, and you get put in the Jews by religion category. If you say no, you are then sent in a different way, and Pew did this very nicely. I think it's a very easy to follow flowchart. So if you say no, I'm not Jewish by religion, you then get channeled to a separate question, which asks, were you raised Jewish or did you have a Jewish parent? And you can say yes or no. And if you say yes, then you get channeled sort of back toward, in which you get asked, what's your religion today? If you say no religion, you're in the study, most likely. If you say I have another religion, you're considered a person of Jewish background, because you have Jewish background, but you practice another religion. American Jews are given, in terms of Jewish community studies, one religion or fewer, and that religion can only be Judaism. If you are a Jewish Buddhist and you identify as such at this part of the survey, you'll be counted as a person of Jewish background. If you're an evangelical Christian who says, I've been grafted into the chosen people, therefore I'm Jewish, you are considered a person of Jewish affinity. If you are a Jew who says, I'm not Jewish, but I identify as Jewish and my parents are Jewish or I converted, you're considered a Jew of no religion. So these categories are not sort of meaningful categories to those of us who walk around like, during the day. I don't think that people tell stories about being a Jew of no religion to themselves, but they're useful categories from Pew's perspective as heuristics. Now, there seem to be ways in which those categories do reflect real sort of sociological patterns, but they're not, I would say, sort of watertight. That is, they're created as categories that are put onto the population. They're not categories that emerge from the population as the language the population uses to describe itself. Like in sort of technical terms, they're not edict, or they are edict. They're put on top of a community by the scholar or by the researcher. They don't reflect the language that the communities use about the ways that they practice. I wrote a paper a long time ago in which I interviewed a bunch of people who said, I'm a Jew and I have no religion. And then I said, well, tell me about your Judaism. And they said, they love the tradition. They hated religion, they loved tradition. And it wasn't my job as a researcher to try to explain what was what. I was just like, oh, it's really interesting that they describe their Jewish connections as that of tradition, not of that of religion. So Samira, I think that gets at your question.
It does, and I think that a couple of things that I wanted to sort of highlight. Excuse me for just a. We're just gonna pat her, then we'll have less barking. One of the things that I really wanted to highlight is this reality that the categories of a study may or may not be the categories that people find personally meaningful. And so when you look at a study and what it tells you, you need to think about and you need to figure out, are these categories that are coming externally? Are they categories that are coming from the community? Because that helps you understand how to read and parse the data. The other thing, because before I sidetracked Ari with the question, or sidetracked our conversation with my question for Ari, the other thing I think we want to think about is sometimes funders do have politics. I think the Pew, part of what's so valuable about the Pew study is what a distance there is, right? Like, I have no idea what Pew's sort of agenda is. I've always regarded them as really being interested in generating a kind of information. That's not always true of funders. And you might agree or you might disagree with the goal of the funder, right? You might have someone who is studying a group for reasons that you think are politically amazing or politically terrible. And the data maybe doesn't have anything to do with the politics, right? You can have really good information that comes out of a study that then gets presented in ways that you feel sort of politically gross about. You can have a study that does work that makes claims that you politically support 150%, but the actual process seems a little suspect. And so I think that's another thing that it's important to remember, right? As you're sort of parsing, what do we think of the funders and their politics? That's a different question from evaluating whether the study was done well. I think that's an important thing to remember because it can be really tempting to throw away data when you don't agree with its framing. And it can be really tempting to embrace data when you do. But that's a different question from the methodology that informed it. Be that the way that the survey was put together, be that the way that the ethnographer went about finding the communities to study, be that sort of the choices that the historian made about what archives to look at and be informed by. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think both of you bring about very important points with regards to the architecture of a study and what it is, who it is that holds power in what will then result in findings of a study. So I think it's interesting because you might do all the things they need to do to get it passed through a rigorous IRB, internal review board, in order for you to move forward with a particular study. And at the same time, there can be, as we know, there's bias in everything we do. There's bias in what it is that we want to study. There's bias in research methodologies. There's as much as we try to reduce it, these biases, it exists. It'd be silly for us to think that they're not in the realm and that they don't exist in a particular place and time. And on that note, I'm thinking a lot about what it takes to then interpret data. So we know that when it comes to creating research, getting to the point in which we are able to have data, that there is a big role that the researchers play in kind of creating thinking about what questions they're going to ask, thinking about which types of methods they're going to use. But now let's say we've got the data and now it's time to interpret the data. And so I really think that interpreting the data has become just as important, if not more, than asking good questions, right? So now we've got this information and now it's up to the person who is going to disseminate this information and be able to share what it means, make sense of it. And at times that's a really great responsibility that leads to then either anxiety or panic or feeling uncounted or unseen in different spaces. And so I'd love to hear from both of you with that in mind. What have interpreters of past data studies, what have they missed in Jewish demographic studies, and how has that how have they interpreted something that has led to a whole different way in which to look at what's important when it comes to just continuing a particular focus on a particular study. So I know that we talked a little bit about this. Samira, I'd love to start with you because there was something that you said last time specifically about studies that were taking place and the anxiety that kind of came about around Jewish continuity.
So I think that what you want to sort of think about here, politics is very important in how data gets interpreted. And so the conversation about Jewish continuity makes a point. There's an article written by several of our colleagues, Lila Berman, Ronit Stahl, and Kate Rosenblatt. And if you Google their names, they've got a forward op-ed that is really easily available. There's also an article in American Jewish History. And what they basically are talking about is they're talking about the fact that you end up with real anxiety about Jewish continuity in the 1970s. And we tend to assume when we talk about Jewish continuity that anxiety about continuity is the product and the result of the Holocaust, that is where it came from. And so, we've got sort of anxiety about Jewish continuity that dates to the 1950s. And what we really see, if you go back and sort of look at, it's not that nobody was talking about it at all, but if you look at the real sort of bulk of anxiety, it comes about in the 70s. And what these scholars argue, and actually there's a piece in Lilith magazine that's from 1978, that talks about the fact that these are perhaps actually anxieties that are tied to rising interfaith marriage rates, and also to kind of trends having to do with the feminist movement. So I'm super interested in this because I wrote a book about interfaith marriage, and now I'm writing a book about birth control. And they argue that what people are really worried about, or what I argue in this case, this is a little bit that what I end up arguing, is that there are these sort of women are still saying that they want to have 3 or 4 children, but they're starting later. And so there's a lot of concern that like they'll run out of time, but also that part of the reason that they're delaying childbirth is to get educations and have careers. And as many of you have probably noticed, it's hard to juggle children and careers. And so the fear and the thought is that they will sort of have 1 or 2 kids and they'll be like, okay, this is enough, we're at capacity, and they won't have 3 or 4. So there's a lot of anxiety in that moment about continuity. And so you get a lot of studies, and the studies are sort of ratchet up the anxiety about continuity, ratchet up, sort of say, this is a problem, and how might we solve the problem? How might we discourage interfaith marriage, which is clearly not good for Judaism? How might we, this one doesn't get legs in quite the same way, but how might we sort of encourage women to stay home and run the sisterhood and do things like that? And there's a lot of conversation about that in this sort of late 70s moment. And the question that then I think you could pose is, you could take this data and let us say that the data is good, right? And you could say, what do we then do to create a Judaism that meets the needs of these people? What do we do to create a Judaism that meets the needs of interfaith families? How do we figure out what the needs of interfaith families are? How do we ask them about what they want rather than sort of identifying things that they do that we think are problems? How do we support women entering the workforce and create a Judaism that works well with 2-parent families, or not 2-parent families, two working parent families? How do we create a Judaism that supports single parent households? How do we make a bigger tent, right? You can use the same data and then it depends on what direction you're problem solving, right? So the continuity crisis chooses to try to problem solve around preventing interfaith marriage and ends up not problem solving quite as hard around sort of changes having to do with feminism, but doesn't necessarily problem solve well around changing structures of the American family, right? The increase in single parent households and other things like that. So what would happen if instead, right, you asked that set of questions? Another way of looking at it would be if you think about interfaith family research, if you look at the families, like if what you're looking for from interfaith families is what percentage of these folks are raising children exclusively Jewishly, it's not usually the majority. But if you look at the percentage that is including Judaism in the array of choices that families are making, that's a really solid majority. And so, there's a little bit of a glass half full, glass half empty in how you present and tell that story. Is this a story of failure when people have interfaith marriages, only this less than 50% are having exclusively Jewish homes? Or is it a story of a win in which far more than 50% are including Judaism in their households, right? It becomes a matter of how you interpret and frame the data. And then I'm sometimes in this business, although not always, how you then talk to people about how they might feel about the data, what they might do, what might count as productive ways to structure community life, right? What happens when you frame something as a problem? And what happens when you frame something as information about how your community is changing and what you might need to do in order to keep up with the changes of your community?
Thank you, Samira. I mean, something you said before I pass it to Ari, just thinking about asking questions from a point of curiosity and ways in which you see it as the information you will gather, as allowing you to then create different types of program and support systems to continue with how your community continues to grow and the needs that it's going to continue to have as a result of a shift that it's experiencing. But a lot of the ways in which data has been interpreted has been seeing shifts, or specifically as some of the ones that you mentioned, as points of not just anxiety, but things we should really be fearful of, right? So it's not just like, oh no, this is happening, but it's like this, we should do everything to prevent this thing from happening. And as a result of that, of course, what takes place, people whose identities, whose families are part of what has now become a source of anxiety for the Jewish community, or something that we're trying to avoid, can begin to feel as something that's a personal attack on oneself or on one's family dynamic or way in which they are choosing to live their life. So I think that's an important piece of how then the anxiety, the ripple effects that results as of that. So Ari, I'm going to pass it to you, see if there's any other information you'd love to add there.
I'll be real brief because we're coming up on the top of the hour and I want to hear some questions from people. But I'll just say the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey focused American sort of communal efforts, the efforts of foundations and federations, the sort of legacy organizations of American Jewish life, around intermarriage in a way that had never happened in the past and hasn't happened since, and sort of set a very peculiar sort of mark for the impact of data, the impact that data can have on directing communal resources. The response was very much, as Samira said, we need to stop intermarriage. Now, Lucia framed the question in terms of interpreting data. I tend to think of interpreting data as a very narrow thing. Like, this is what people who collect the data do before they share the narrative with the public. But like, everybody's got their hot take. And so there's a sort of secondary interpretation that happens in the Jewish press. And among people who direct large organizations, when they get data, to then say, oh, well, this is a portrait of my community, this is a portrait of my world, and here's how I'm going to allocate resources or allocate resources, financial, human, whatever, toward addressing this point because I want to see the needle move up or down, whatever. So in 1990, the report came out and reported that unprecedented numbers of Jews were marrying unprecedented numbers of non-Jews. The response was to try to bring that number down, the institutional response. And I have been thinking a lot, sort of imagining a counterfactual, which is what would our Jewish world have looked like in the years since 1990? Had the response been something different? Had the response been, we have all of these families, we have all these new families. What if we can't stop people from falling in love with one another? This is a success of American Jewish life, in fact. We can't stop people from falling in love with each other. But what if we can change our organizations so that they can embrace or make space for these new families in formation? what if the last 32 years of American Jewish life wasn't dictated by a terror around, and the panic, anxiety, I think was the language that Samira used, around Jews marrying people who don't identify as Jewish, and was organized around an enterprise that was about bringing them in as full families with complex identities, with multifaceted identities, and tried to embrace them and make space for them and provide for them. I think that for me, that question is one that I sort of think about all the time. We'd have a very different story on our hands. And so I'll say that, and that's the sort of secondary interpretation of the data. I don't know that you'd be able to wring a different story out of the specific data that was collected in the 1990 NJPS, other than that statistic about Jews marrying non-Jews. But I think the secondary interpretation, what does this mean? How do I act on it? How do I allocate resources in response to it? I think is always the question, because as academics, like, we have a teeny bit of power to like collect data and do whatever. People with serious resources can marshal their power much more readily than we can, for sure. Hold on one sec. I don't have a pet, but I have children, so give me a sec.
And while Ari is handling the children, I will say that I think that what you get there is you get real potential, right? What happens when you frame people as problems, right? What do you do to how they do or don't feel welcome? What happens when you frame families as problems? That really changes the kind of narrative and the options that are available to you. But part of what that does mean, and I think that this is, again, coming as somebody who, like, the bulk of my work is historical, I think that there is this impetus to pick a moment, perhaps a moment that you're romanticizing a little bit, freeze it in time and say, that's the community that we want. Another story that we can tell, and that we can tell with like great historical accuracy, is that things are in constant flux, right? There are moments when there are massive kinds of change, right? Think about the Industrial Revolution. There isn't a lot of point to sort of bemoan the fact that we're not all characters in a Shalom Aleichem story, right? And that's the kind of thing that is going to continue to change. We're not all going to be Tevye the dairyman. I, for instance, am afraid of cows. But where are we, how do you use the data to sort of chart a future that has potential, rather than to trying to hang on to a past that may or may not be accurate anyway?
Thank you. I have a couple of questions from the audience that Jordan has sent me, and I want to make sure we have not so much time, but I want to make sure to at least get some of them in this space. One of them is specifically looking at how previous studies have historically looked at or gathered the majority, or summarized the majority of information through an Ashkenazi normative lens. Okay, and so curious to know how this is changing, and if you're specifically in some of the Ari, in your most recent time that you spent with Pew as an advisor, curious if even this conversation around Ashkenazi normativity was coming up, like in the boardroom, on the table. Like, was this a conversation? Was there some form of what was being done to essentially challenge this, to change this? And also, just from the same person that's asking this question, wanting to kind of elevate the fact that secular and cultural Jews are a huge part of many communities, and should be counted as such. Absolutely, that's an honest opinion and a real one. So,
yeah, I'm not a fan of the term Ashkenazi normativity, because it turns out the adherence between sort of Ashkenaziness or Sephardiness and one's own racialized identity is not like a correspond. I'm fine talking about white Jews, that's great, but I think Ashkenaziness is a bit more. I mean, we saw this in the Beyond the Count study that I was part of. Ashkenaziness is a bit more free floating. It doesn't adhere to race quite so readily, but I think the question is a good one. I think the Jewish community is just the sort of the people who are responsible for these kind of demographic studies, these large scale studies that we're talking about, these population studies, are beginning to, well, for starters, they're asking questions. You can only ever get data about questions you ask in response to questions that you ask. So the fact that they're starting to ask questions regularly on these studies is a huge step forward. I realize it seems like a very small one, but it's actually a fantastic and most welcome change to the practice of just not asking the questions. Now, whether or not how the questions are evolving to reflect the broad diversity of experiences among Jews who hold different racialized identities or different ethnic identities. That change is, I think, probably going to come soon. I think people are reckoning with it. That is, is lighting. I'll take lighting Shabbat candles as like Passover, right? Do you keep Passover? Well, yes, no. Well, do we want to know if you eat legumes on Passover or not? Like, do we want to know about the nature of your traditional observance of this holiday and how far down that, how many questions do we think that kind of inquiry is worth in terms of capturing the range of ways in which people who do observe in relation to a specific tradition or heritage of practice. I think those questions are coming. Remember that we just had the very first national study of self-identified Jews of color that came out last year. I was part of the research team that produced it with the Jews of Color Initiative. Samira is now doing an additional study funded by Luce, National Institute of Luce, right?
Funded by Luce, and we'll be collecting oral histories. So I won't be sort of producing the kind of report that the Beyond the Count did. What I will rather be doing is creating an archive that other people can go into to do all sorts of kinds of quantitative and qualitative work. Yeah, so we're like, the ball's getting rolling. I think it's accelerating quite quickly. So I feel good about that. And in the past year, I've gotten a number of requests for proposals for community studies, all of which said we want to make sure that we can assess the racial and ethnic diversity of our community. So the fact that that's in the call for, that's the way they hire researchers. The fact it's in the call for researchers, I think, is a good sign. We're certainly not where we need to be, but I would say the progress made over the last 3 or 4 years has been is good. It's in the right direction. And I think that this is a place where it's also really useful to remember that there are lots of kinds of research and lots of things that count as data, right? So what happens if you start taking into account things like Rebecca Davis, who is a historian who doesn't work primarily in Jewish studies, wrote a book about conversion. And in her book about conversion, and it's celebrity conversion. So Muhammad Ali, Claire Booth Luce, Sammy Davis Jr., right? So that is a story of somebody becoming Jewish. And if you take that kind of work into account, there's even more. And I really think that you get the best sort of picture of things when you put the different kinds of work into conversation with each other. And so I would really sort of encourage people to think broadly about how they get their stories. You can get really broad-based information, and then you can get things that are sort of narrower that help flesh out and give you some of those details, like who's eating what on Passover, and that kind of question.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get to 2 more questions. And I just want to kind of emphasize a little bit of what Ari was saying in the beginning around kind of maybe the misuse of Ashken normativity. And I think what I think that term is actually trying to get to is this old vision of New York Jews that somehow has kind of stayed in people's mind as this caricature that has become like the Jewish people in all stories, right? And a lot of, for people who don't have enough information, because as the study, as Beyond the Count showed, was that a number of our members, our community, who are community Jews of color within our community, identify as Ashkenazi. And so when we use that term to kind of label it or be synonymous with whiteness, we're losing a lot of nuance to what it actually means to be Jewish and what it actually means to be multiracial and multi-ethnic. And so just wanting to bring back some caution around when we're using that term to think, are we using it to mean white? And if we are, why don't we just say that? Because it could be a lot more confusing. So one of the questions that I thought was great was regarding to kind of disaggregating data. So specifically with like Beyond the Count, we were able to bring about a number of different narratives that people self-identified with whatever group that they said was important for them to identify with. But curious if there's any talk you've heard about funding more studies on different racial cultural communities within Jewish community and ways in which maybe disaggregating data can kind of be a first step in doing so. And maybe I'll ask one person, Ari, just you can answer that.
they're not coming to me, and they shouldn't. I'm happy to advise on those studies, but we should. This is for us and for the team that did be on the count. A key piece of it was that we had a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious team, actually. And so part of the effort is also growing a generation of researchers who identify as people of color, Jews of color, so that they can sort of conduct the research with the appropriate sensitivities. Disaggregating the data, we've gotten that question a lot. It's really hard to do because once you start breaking down, like if you have 1,000 respondents and you only really want the 22, like the 22% that identified as X, and you really don't want the women in the 22% of that, then you end up with a very small number of people that doesn't have a lot of statistical power, right? You end up with like 42 people, and 42 people don't represent. Moving from 42 people representing thousands of people is really complicated. So we haven't done that, but I do hope there's funding coming down to do additional studies. Ours was, I'm really proud of the work we did, but it was very much the beginning. So hopefully there will be lots and lots more, both sort of incorporated into some of these demographic studies that we were talking about, but the work Samira's doing is awesome. There should be more targeted studies as well. There's a lot to change that narrative of American Jewry away from that of the Lower East Side. Which was never the Lower East Side to begin with, but like to change it away from that sort of bagels and lox Judaism of American Jewry. We need a lot more stories out there, and some of that's going to come from research.
Thank you. And Samira, I'm going to ask you this last question, and it's a big one. But I think when it comes to, at this moment in time, when it comes to Jewish research, a lot of researchers claim that they don't ask questions of whether or not Jews identify as Zionists because Jews don't understand what Zionism is. That seems like a political move to hide the number of Jews who don't identify as Zionists. How do we convince researchers to ask the question?
So I just got back from a conference, and my roommate at the conference is someone who studies early 20th century Zionism. And so we had this great conversation. And I think that, absolutely, people don't understand the full nuance of the political history of Zionism, because in our contemporary setting, Zionism tends to mean support for the state of Israel and very specific support for the state of Israel, right? And so I think that one answer is it's uncomfortable. There are real shifts in how people feel about Israel. They're pretty generational, but not exclusively generational. And so part of it is saying, like, look, we don't mean, what do you think about thoughts about a Jewish state or the options of Jewish states in, I don't know, 1915. We're using a contemporary political term. I think you can define your terms as you set up studies, but I think it's risky and it's dangerous, particularly for early career scholars, to do work that may get communal backlash. That's just true. I say this very, very aware, like I'm in the middle of a tenure process right now. And there are things that I might not feel as free to say because of just sort of the broader politics. And so one of the things that I think we need to do is change the sort of communal responses. First of all, this is a generational shift. As younger scholars get older and get more established, they may feel more free to say what they want and need to say, right? Or what their research finds about a huge array of opinions in the Jewish community, right? But the other thing that is true is you need to create a Jewish community that is less likely to litmus test people and less likely to bring its political agenda to scholarship that it doesn't like. And that's the kind of thing that can be done by creating spaces and venues like this one, right? This is the kind of thing that progressive Jewish organizations can create a space and an audience for that kind of research.
Thank you so much. Samira, Ari, I mean, it was, as always, it's a pleasure to be able to be with you both, to think about, to be able to bring data to the lives of so many other people who might not be thinking about it on a daily basis, and to look at it through your perspectives and to be able to make it something that's accessible to all. I know that there in the past year, There has been different calls for people who are interested in exploring different studies. I know JOCI put out a call earlier this year, and I think they'll probably want to do another one in the future. And as Samira said, if we can find more ways to fund different studies, people who are looking at things through a perspective that they're eager to know more about, this is the way in which you're going to be able to continuously create more ways in which to look at this multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural community that is Jewish peoplehood. So to all of you, thank you so much for joining us today, for spending the first part of your evening with us. We really look forward to continuing this conversation. And I know that Jordan will be reaching out about the future speaking engagements that are going to be coming up as part of the series. So with that, thank you so much. And we'll see you all soon at another talk.
And thank you as well, Analucía. Thanks so much, all of you panelists. I stand all of you. And as you said, Samira, we're really happy to and proud to be an organization who's working on creating that space along with our partners at IfNotNow. So thanks so much, everyone. We love you all, and I look forward to hopefully, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about any of our organizations. And I look forward to hearing from as many of you as would like to reach out.
Good night.